Good evening. Welcome to People's University Around the World in Literature and Language. Tonight, we're going all the way to Australia. Brad Fitzmaurice is a former counselor and vice president of the Royal Australian Historical Society. His master's dissertation examined the work of a group of Australian writers in the 1890s and early 1900s. He currently teaches American history at Australia's oldest tertiary institution, the University of Sydney, and he's writing a PhD on the history of our town, Wheeling, West Virginia. He's going to tell you all about Australian literature tonight. Here is Brad Fitzmaurice.
Thanks, Sean. Good to be with you, and big good day to my friends in the friendly city. It's now customary in Australia for public addresses, be they official speeches or university lectures, to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. And I'd like to begin this presentation by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. You know, unlike you folks in the US, we Aussies have never fought a war of independence against the British. The closest we've come is the 1932-33 Ashes series, when the English cricket team devised the sly tactic of bowling at the body with intent to harm and stop our best batsman, Don Bradman, from scoring runs. Whereas your head of state lives in a big white house in Pennsylvania Avenue in your nation's capital, my official head of state does not even live in Australia, but in a big white palace in London. And whereas your star-spangled banner is distinctly yours, my national flag has a constellation of stars known as the Southern Cross, but also bears another man's cross, the Union Jack. Nevertheless, we do have our own lingo and our own national literature. But before I get into that, it might be an idea to just give a quick geography lesson. My sense is that not all Americans are familiar with Australia. It's actually bigger than Texas. In fact, if we can go to the first slide, we can see that it's actually bigger than the United States. The key thing, though, is that there is no Mississippi River running down the middle. In fact, there's nothing in the middle. Most of the population is in coastal cities. The total population of Australia is just a little bit more than the state of Florida and a little bit less than the state of Texas. Some of you may recall last Christmas we had some fires. We call them bushfires, you call them wildfires. The next slide gives you some indication of just how extensive the fires were. And hopefully we'll see that next slide. So Australia is made up of states and territories. Queensland to the north, famous for the beaches of Surfers Paradise, the Great Barrier Reef. The Northern Territory, high percentage of Indigenous people. There's a big rock there. It used to be called Ayers Rock. Now it's called Uluru. Western Australia is where we mine the ore that we sell to China. South Australia is where we grow our best wine, and is a state that prides itself on being the only state where there were no convicts. There's a little island down the bottom underneath Victoria that a lot of people forget. It's Tasmania, formerly called Van Diemen's Land. It's where we grow hops and apples. Victoria, the capital of Victoria is Melbourne. A lot of rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne. Mostly that's because people in Melbourne have a chip on their shoulders. Ava Gardner went to Melbourne to make a film with Gregory Peck and Fred Astaire called On the Beach. When she was asked what she thought of Melbourne, she said that it was a wonderful place to make a film about the end of the world. Halfway between Melbourne and Sydney is Canberra, our equivalent to Washington, DC. And the largest and most populous state is New South Wales, the capital of which is Sydney, famous for its harbour, the Opera House, and the Harbour Bridge. I know some of you are a little sort of uncomfortable about living in a place with a name that means place of the skull. I'm actually speaking to you tonight from a beachside suburb of Sydney called Coogee, which is an Aboriginal word for bad smell. So there you go. The bad smell, by the way, is because the seaweed used to wash up on the sand and rot in the sun. So there's a geography lesson. Let's get back to the presentation. What I want to do, I want to do four things. Firstly, I want to provide some context to the emergence of that distinct Australian national literature and the composition of Australia's unofficial national anthem, Waltzing Matilda. Written in 1895, supposedly in response to a shearers' strike, Waltzing Matilda is full of vernacular and colloquialism. It's highly indicative of the poetry and ballads that described pioneering life in the outback, a life so vastly different from that of England's green and present land. Second, I want to provide some background on the bloke who wrote it, Banjo Patterson, as well as another poet, his rival for the title of Australia's favourite poet, Henry Lawson. Third, I want to translate Waltzing Matilda, explain its meaning, and finally, I want to decipher some Australian slang. I want to tell you what a budgie smuggler is, and I want to pose the $64,000 question, how good would Professor Javasak look wearing them? Okay, so the political entity that exists in Australia today was formed on January 1, 1901, when the Queen's representative and leaders of the colony met in a public park, not unlike Wheeling Park, and established the Commonwealth of Australia. The years leading up to that event were turbulent times. The gold rushes of the 1850s brought wealth and immigrants to the colonies and ushered in a period of prosperity known as the Great Boom. That ended in the early 1890s when prolonged drought and failing commodity prices resulted in economic recession and repeated strike action from an invigorated and newly formed labour movement. At about the same time Wheeling was suffering the Great Nailers' Strike, Australia was having its own Great Shearers' Strike. A shearer, by the way, cuts wool from a sheep. During this period of social unrest, which coincided with the locally born becoming the majority of the population, Australians began to explore what it meant to be an Australian. The search for a national identity found expression in a number of ways. In politics, through the emergence of a Republican movement advocating cutting constitutional ties with Mother England. In art, through the work of a group of painters who began to interpret the local landscape by emphasising light and colour. And in a distinct national literature that was raw, parochial, masculine, and class conscious, as expressed in Henry Lawson's stirring verse, and we've got a slide coming up, they tramp in mateship side by side, the Protestant and Roman, They call no bipe lord or sir, and tip their hat to no man. The lodestar of this search for an Australian identity was that vast sunburnt land of the interior, commonly referred to as the bush, or simply the outback. Its heroes were the stout, resilient, itinerant workers, the shearers and the drovers, who would in time be re-imaged as heroes of war by a small group of journalists and historians that included the father of Rupert Murdoch, current owner of Fox News. These guys together collectively created the legend of Anzac. It was, of course, deeply ironic that a rurally focused national identity was forged by city poets for what was then and remains today a highly urbanised nation. The shearers and drovers of the Australian outback were in some ways like the cowboys of the American West, but they assumed an even greater significance in the national psyche because, unlike the cowboys, they weren't competing with other national myths and narratives. In the absence of any Puritan covenant, any claim to be the custodian of universal principles, or even Revolutionary War heroes, the shearers and drovers were all our poets and national myth makers had to work with. The legendary men of the Australian bush were not burdened by the fulfillment of a divine mission to create a city on the hill. That would be a shining example to the rest of the world. They weren't projected as being driven by any sense of manifest destiny. And so it was, as Lawson put it, no church bell rings them from the track. No pulpit lights their blindness. 'Tis hardship, drought, and homeless that teach those bushmen kindness. There were very few leaves of grass instilling hope and confidence in the Australian outback. Whereas Whitman could rejoice, and I think we've got a slide for Whitman, could rejoice in a voluptuous, cool, breathed earth of the slumbering and liquid trees, earth of the mountain's misty top, earth of shine and dark mottling the tide of a river. Australian poets were left hoping, if still from deserts the prophets come. The Australian bushman had one further defining characteristic. Whereas the American frontier produced legends of rugged individualism personified in the likes of fictional heroes like James Fenimore Cooper's Natty Bumppo, real life people like Daniel Boone and your own Lewis Wetzel, the most admired and enduring quality that supposedly emerged from the Australian bush was mateship. As one bard put it, and I think we've got a slide for the next one. We learnt the creed at Hungerford. We learnt the creed at Burke. We learnt it in the good times and learnt it out of work. We learnt it by the harbour side and on the billabong. No matter what a mate may do, a mate can do no wrong. So tales of progression from Log House to the White House had no resonance here because they didn't fit a narrative that emphasised the collective, not the individual. Much of the work produced by these identity-seeking political activists, artists, and writers were experimental. The Republicans looked to France and the US, especially after it had proven that a house divided could be patched up and made to stand. Labour leaders toyed with ideas of establishing a workers' paradise, but in the end decided to stick within the existing framework and formalised industrial relations by establishing a political wing known as the Australian Labor Party. The artist adopted the new style of Impressionism that had emerged in France. The writers embraced a literary realism in the style of American writers like Stephen Crane and Rebecca Harding Davis. But rather than describing the traumas of war and factory life, the Australian writers experimented with tales of life in the outback and did so in a distinctly irreverent tone. The one thing that seemed to unite all Australians in their search for a national identity was a common view on race. From Wangaratta in Victoria to Woolloomooloo in New South Wales, there was a general agreement that having outgrown its original purpose as a penal colony, by 1901 Australia had acquired a new mission, and that was to preserve the purity of the white race. We became a social Darwinist quarantine station. The first two pieces of legislation enacted by the Australian Parliament, together known as the White Australia Policy, were designed to keep Australia white. The sheer scale and size of the continent was too big to build a wall. But immigration officials were able to strictly enforce a dictation test requiring any new immigrant to be tested in any language deemed appropriate. As it turned out, very few Chinese spoke ancient Gaelic. The young Australian-born writers seeking their own distinct voice willingly complied with this overt institutionalised racism. Their main publishing vehicle was the weekly Sydney newspaper, The Bulletin. Founded in 1880, in 1886, the paper's masthead was changed from Australia for Australians to Australia for the white man. Under the editorship of J.F. Archibald, the Bulletin nurtured young Australian writers and supported them in their search for identity. The tragic irony was that, blinded by the prevailing racism, the writers failed to see what was truly unique about the Australian experience, rather than a fabricated image of a place full of egalitarians unconcerned with self-advancement. What was unique was an ancient nomadic culture of an Indigenous people that had survived and adapted to a harsh and barren land. But embracing that culture was simply a bridge too far. The powers of perception of these young aspiring writers was also affected by the fact that many of them were very often blind drunk. Foremost among what came to be known as the wattle and bottle school of Australian literature was Henry Lawson and A.B. Banjo Patterson. Lawson and Patterson are often remembered alongside each other as Australia's most iconic and influential writers. But they represented very different interpretations of life in the Australian bush. Lawson's poetry was often gloom and doom. Patterson's was highly romanticised and heroic. This was reflected of their different upbringings and life trajectories. One of the few things they had in common was that they both failed to gain entry to Sydney University. Henry Lawson lived a tragic life, but few, if any, better captured the spirit of the Australian outback and the search for a distinct Australian identity. He was born on a goldfield 200 miles west of Sydney on the 17th of June, 1867. By the way, as an aside, it was on that day the Wheeling Intelligencer announced that the directors of the struggling Wheeling Library Association were meeting that evening to plan arrangements for the visit to Wheeling of the renowned dramatist James E. Murdoch. As the paper put it, the time has come when a series of first-class intellectual entertainments can be presented to the public with a fair prospect of success. Hitherto it has been said of Wheeling that nothing save a circus, a Negro minstrel show, or a travelling troupe of some sort could count on success. Well, I'm neither a circus performer, minstrel, or travelling troubadour, but I would like to take this opportunity to say how pleased I am that the directors persisted and that a Wheeling Public Library was eventually opened, and how grateful I am to Sean and Professor Javasak for the opportunity of being part of this program. Back to Lawson. Lawson had a troubled and disruptive childhood. His parents' marriage did not last, and by the time he was 14, Henry was totally deaf. His mother took him to Sydney, where she became the editor of the first women's magazine in Australia. She encouraged her son's writing, and by the time he was 20, the Bulletin had published his poem Song of the Republic, with its rousing Republican refrain, "Sons of the South make choice between, sons of the South choose true, the land of morn and the land of Eden, the old dead tree and the young dead tree, the land that belongs to the Lord and the Queen, and the land that belongs to you." Lawson became an alcoholic, suffered from mental illness, and spent several periods in Sydney's notorious Darlinghurst jail. At the Bulletin, he had come under the spell of the editor Archibald, who, in an effort to help Lawson curb his drinking, sent him on a tour of the Outback. That was to provide the inspiration for his greatest writings. Lawson wrote of resilience in the face of hardship. If there was ever such a thing, he was the true bard of the bush. His writings were highly politicized and galvanized the labor movement. Thus, he wrote, "So we must fly a rebel flag, as others did before us. And we must sing a rebel song and join in rebel chorus. We'll make the tyrants feel the sting, oh, those that they would throttle. They needn't say the fault is ours, if blood should stain the wattle." Lawson died a lonely death in 1921. He's buried about the same distance the Ohio County Public Library is from Mount Wood Cemetery, from where I'm sitting now. In the last years of his life, he was reduced to composing ditties and rhyming couplets in exchange for money to buy a drink. He'd seen the end coming a long time before. As early as 1892, he'd written, "Well, perhaps it isn't funny. There were links between us two. He had memories of cities. He had been a jackaroo. And perhaps his face forewarned me of a faith that I might see, from a bitter cup reflected in the wretched days to be." Andrew Barton Banjo Patterson was born on a farm 50 miles west of Sydney on the 17th of February 1864. He died in Sydney in 1941. His mother was related to Australia's first Prime Minister. He attended Sydney Grammar School, Sydney's equivalent of Lindsay, and practiced as a solicitor. His first poems were published in the Bulletin in 1885. In 1895, he went with his fiancée to Dagworth Station, a sheep and cattle farm in central West Queensland, where there had recently been violent strike action by the shearers. While at Dagworth Station, Patterson wrote the lyrics to Waltzing Matilda. His fiancée's best friend, Christina, who lived at the house, wrote the music. Patterson is alleged to have had an affair with Christina. It seems the composer of Australia's official national anthem was a bit of a ladies' man. Patterson ended up selling the rights to Waltzing Matilda and some other pieces to his publishers for £5. So, let's look at what is arguably Australia's most famous verse, Banjo Patterson's Waltzing Matilda. I'm just going to read the verses to you and then offer some sort of translation. So here we go, Waltzing Matilda. Once a jolly swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." Down came a jumbuck to drink at that billabong. Up jumped the swagman and grabbed him with glee. And he sang as he shoved that jumbuck in his tucker bag, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." Up rode the squatter mounted on his thoroughbred. Down came the troopers, 1, 2, 3. "Where's that jolly jumbuck you've got in your tucker bag? You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." Up jumped the swagman and sprang into the billabong. "You'll never catch me alive," said he, and his ghost may be heard as you pass by that billabong. "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." So a crude and rough translation goes like this. An itinerant bushwalker, a swagman, who carries his clothes and possessions in a bag attached to a pole slung across his shoulder, a Matilda, takes rest at a waterhole, a billabong, and boils a pot of tea. A sheep, a jumbuck, comes down to drink at the same waterhole. The man captures the sheep, puts it in his food bag, his tucker bag, and as he does so, another man who owns the sheep and claims title to the land, the squatter, appears along with 3 policemen. Rather than be captured himself, the thief commits suicide by diving into the water. Waltzing Matilda is hardly a battle cry of freedom. In its glorification of a criminal act, an unhappy ending, it offers a dubious base for a national anthem. It's crude, irreverent, and sardonic. But as such, it captures the essence of a young nation's search for identity through literature and song. Okay, so I want to end the presentation by asking the question, what's a budgie smuggler? I've got some photos. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to bring them up. Here we go. So these photos depict men with 2 things in common. Firstly, they're all wearing budgie smugglers. And secondly, all 3 have held the office of Prime Minister. All 3 were elected as members of the Conservative Party, which in Australia is called the Liberal Party. And just in case any of you think that budgie smugglers are exclusive to the Conservatives, the final photo is Australia's longest-serving Labor Prime Minister, Bob Hawke. And I think we've got the photo. Yes, there he is. Doesn't he remind you of Professor Javasak? Okay, that's the presentation. Thanks for listening. Happy to answer any questions, or try to answer any questions that anyone has. Thank you. Someone has just thanked me for my interest in the library. The library is your library is a fantastic resource, but the thing that's really special about the library are the people that work in it. I've had sort of nothing but first class assistants, and I can't speak highly enough of Dottie and her staff. It's a real bonus for me to have such a great facility available. I'm I was just about to say I'm surprised that no one's asked me yet why am I writing a PhD on wheeling. So I used to live in New York, and I started work on a short story, and I needed a place to set the scene. And I was familiar with a song by Neil Sedaka that he recorded in Sydney when he was here. The song is called "Where Is the Guy from Wheeling, West Virginia." It was a very popular song here in Australia. It didn't really chart in the US. So I had this idea of this sort of notion of wheeling. And I started to do some research about the place, which I knew absolutely nothing. And I stumbled across the Ohio County Public Library, and in particular, the Lunch with Books program. And I watched and enjoyed very much Professor Javasek's series on the history of wheeling. And I thought, sounds like an interesting place. And the more I looked into it, the more fascinated I became. And next thing I know, that's what I'm doing my PhD on. Hello, Jean. That's a very interesting question. I have actually submitted a list of recommended Australian authors to the library. There are so many to pick from. Peter Carey is an Australian writer based in the US who is sometimes touted as a potential future Nobel Prize winner. I would look at I'd certainly look at his work. He's written about Ned Kelly. He's actually written an interesting appraisal of de Tocqueville's trips through America. There are a few new to the scene women writers. They're on the list as well. I think that the one Australian writer who's not really contemporary, but who stands out for me is Patrick White. He did win the Nobel Prize for Literature. He's dense, but he does sort of, to me, capture what Australia is all about. But as I said, there is a fairly comprehensive list that the library now has, which I'd recommend people having a look at. Can I give a brief history of the Kelly gang? Okay, so they were Irish immigrants, and they, as a family, grew up in rural Victoria. They were criminals. They robbed post office and banks, but they had this sort of like Robin Hood quality to them, and they were able to escape capture from the police because the locals took them in and supported them. What they are known for, and this is captured in a number of movies, one of which was starred Mick Jagger. They were known for their final showdown at a place called Glen Rowan. They knew that the police were coming, and Ned, who was the elder brother, came up with this idea that they would fit themselves out with armor. So they had big hats and full body armor suit, which they had sort of forged out of the metals that were available to them. So in a famous scene, early in the morning, the police descended upon them, and there they came out in their armor. The problem was the armor was so heavy, they couldn't move. So most of them were killed. Ned Kelly managed to survive. He was tried and hanged in Melbourne, and supposedly the last words he uttered were "such is life." So they represent this sort of Irish rebellious part of the Australian identity. We glorify them. At the end of the day, they were louts and they were criminals. Well, that's a very interesting question, and it's a very good question, and the answer is no. You'd be surprised how many Australians are not aware of what Waltzing Matilda means. I think that's a reflection of a number of things. Firstly, it was written a long time ago, but secondly, more importantly, it speaks to the fact that, as I said before, Australia is a highly urbanized country. Most of the people live in cities. We don't. There isn't a lot of people that live in the outback, and increasingly, what we're seeing is more and more people leaving their farms and coming into the city. So the short answer to your question is, surprisingly, few people actually know what Waltzing Matilda means. And even fewer people are aware of the background to the writing of it, the fact that it was supposedly in response to a shearers' strike in Queensland. That's a very good question, again, and thank you for asking. So again, I like the song. Is the short answer. I like the song. I like anything that draws attention to this. What I think is a rich heritage that Australia has. We, as I said, we still have our head of state living outside of our country, and that will remain so while ever Queen Elizabeth is queen. But I appreciate anything that draws attention to our own attempts to forge a national identity. That's the answer to the question. So another great question, and I was talking to Sean just before the program started, and I mentioned that we thought that we were over the worst of it, but yesterday we had the highest number of infections since the pandemic started. It happened in, it's spreading in Victoria. New South Wales has decided to close the border. I think there's something like 50 different crossings. It's going to be very interesting to see what the government of New South Wales does in the next few days in terms of responding. I think that there is a lot of pressure for us to go back into lockdown again, but obviously the Premier is concerned about the effect that that would have on the economy. Whereas we thought we had done very well, and relative to other places in the world, we have. Whereas we thought that we had seen the worst of it, we haven't. My ancestors come from County Carey in Ireland. Like a lot of Irish immigrants, they came out as a result of the potato famine. I can't trace an ancestry to convicts, which is interesting. That there was a time when it was frowned upon to be seen to be descendant from convicts, but nowadays it's seen as a real honour to be able to trace yourself back from convicts. But unfortunately, I can't do that. I'm assuming that most people are aware that Australia was settled as a jail. The story is that at a pretty much the same time that Ebenezer Zane and his brothers were tracking from the lower Potomac to Wheeling, Lieutenant Cook, as he was then, was commissioned by the Admiralty to sail to Tahiti to witness the transit of Venus. He did that and then opened up his secret commission letters, which said, head south and try and discover the Great South Land. He did. He found it. He reported back that it would be a suitable place to build a jail. And a few years after Cook had reported, the first fleet arrived to set up what was essentially a jail to accommodate the overcrowding in England. Interestingly enough, also at about the same time that the National Road came to Wheeling, opening up a whole new sort of set of economic opportunities, Australian explorers crossed the equivalent of the Allegheny Mountains, opening up great pastures where we could raise sheep. And it was only then that the British realised that, sheep were a nice little earner, and there was probably more benefit in in running it as a sheep farm rather than as a jail. How about some words? Okay, so let me start with septic. Septic is the word Australians use to describe Americans. Septic comes from septic tank, which is rhyming slang for yank. So if you hear an Australian refer to a septic, he's actually talking about an American. I was again speaking to Sean beforehand. I mentioned that one of my students gave as an excuse for late submission of an essay was that while she was minding her parents' house while they were away, and sadly one of the chooks died, and she had to arrange a funeral for the chook, and that's why she was late in submitting her essay. Sean said, "What's a chook?" A chook is a chicken. So there is another one which has just been flashed across the screen. We very often use the expression to piss in your pocket. That actually means to pay someone a compliment. I think what we're doing now, I think I submitted to Sean a number of words that do translate. You'll see them coming across the screen. I'm not sure that Professor Javasak's going to speak to me after this presentation, but maybe I will. Maybe I will. That's of course if I ever get back there. I was planning to be with you in June, July. That obviously didn't happen, and I'm not sure when I will be back, which is a shame, and something I just need to work around. But it's a good idea, Aaron. I'll give some real thought to that. So ketchup is tomato sauce. We have Heinz tomato sauce, but we don't use the word ketchup. But Australians are very fond of tomato sauce, particularly on our pies, which is almost a traditional Australian dish. And we eat pies with mushy peas on top. One of the things about the Australian diet is it took us a long time to actually work out what we should be eating and when. because we were still sort of very much tied to England. And the best example of that is at Christmas time. So Christmas time is around about the, that's the high point of summer. And traditionally, we would be sitting down to this, what effectively is a traditional English meal. Hot vegetables and lots of meat and, big stodgy meals. Increasingly, we're moving away from that now, and we're eating, families are eating more seafood at Christmas time, which is a sort of lot more conducive to the weather. Our eating habits are also, have become much more. We look to Asia now for our food. When I was growing up, rice was considered by my mother a fancy foreign food that we didn't eat. Nowadays, a lot of people eat in Australia eat Asian food. There was a question there that came up, and I just missed it. That's a good question, Aaron. I don't know the answer to that. I think I think it probably speaks to our sort of sense of irreverence, our disrespect for authority, those sorts of things that make the Kelly Gang sort of heroes. The same sort of sense about the guy by the billabong sticking the sheep into his tucker bag. I think it's related to also our Irish heritage, and also I think just general sort of disrespect for authority. So that's a very interesting question. The relationship between Australia and America is something that I'm particularly interested in. There was a critical moment during the Second World War. The Japanese captured Singapore. The Australian Prime Minister at the time, John Curtin, who was an alcoholic, he turned to England, Churchill in particular, and said, "You better come and help us because the Japanese are coming." And Churchill said, "Can't do, sorry. We're flat out trying to defend ourselves." So Curtin gave a very famous speech, which he addressed not to Roosevelt, but to the people of America. And he said, "We now look to you for leadership." And that was the turning point in our relationship with the United States. At that time, MacArthur was doing what he was doing throughout the Pacific. He came to Australia, and that really cemented the relationship. So we have sort of looked to America as our great protector since the Second World War. Obviously, we've grown closer through sort of popular culture. I mean, we watch your TV shows, we listen to your music. We don't understand your politics. We think ours is a more simpler system. We we don't, and I mentioned it during the paper, we don't have this sense that we are, that we have a manifest destiny to be a shining example to the rest of the world. We're a little bit more humble than that. There's lots of things I like about America. I have to say I'm particularly fond of West Virginia. I lived in New York for a while, and I enjoyed that. I think I like what I liked about New York was the density of it all. But I have a particular fondness for Americans, and as I said, I never met a West Virginian I didn't like, or who wasn't someone I'd be happy to call a friend. Yeah, the going forward for us, the critical issue for Australia is our relationship with China. As I mentioned again in the presentation, China buys a lot of our ore. They're a major trading partner, and they're making some big investments. One Australian Prime Minister, Paul Keating, he said that the key question for Australia going forward is whether we seek our security from Asia or within it. And the big question for us going forward is, how is our relationship with China going to affect our relationship with the US? Obviously, it's a work in progress, but that is the key issue for us going forward. At the moment, as you're probably aware, we sort of are happy to act as almost like it's sort of the US deputy sheriff in the Pacific. How sustainable that will be going forward, we just have to wait and see. Not only do I bring the great state of West Virginia into my lectures, but I also make a point, a very special point of mentioning Wheeling. I teach two courses. Firstly, the Civil War, and it's easy to make a link with Wheeling when teaching about the Civil War. The second course, which begins in second semester, is called From Lincoln to Trump. It used to be called From Lincoln to Obama. That one is going to be fascinating this semester, because the course will obviously be conducted in the middle of the campaign, and the students will be sitting down to write their final exams literally as the election is happening. I'm not sure that West Virginia will be critical to the outcome of the election, but you can rest assured that I will find some way of bringing it into the discussion. Let me answer the second question first. It's 9:30 in the morning. It's a miserable day. It's winter. It's raining, and it's cold. The first question is Fitzmaurice a common name? Look, there are quite a few Fitzmaurices in Ireland, but I wouldn't say that it was a common name. No, it's not common. Fitz, by the way, I understand the prefix Fitz means bastard son of, which I think was used when royalties had children out of wedlock.
I'm going to jump in here, and I want to thank Brad for a great presentation. Let him off the hook with the questions. Thank you, Brad.
Thanks, Sean.
Okay.
Good to be with you.
I just want to announce that next week, really the whole week is Italy week, because on Tuesday at noon, we'll be visiting the Heinz History Center and their Italian-American collection. And they'll talk about immigration to Pittsburgh and to Wheeling. And then on Thursday, for this program, Literature and Language Around the World, Lou Volpe, who taught me English and English literature in high school, will be our professor, and will take us to Italy and teach us some Italian of the Italian language. Lou's a great guy if you don't know him. So thanks again, Brad, and thanks to everyone who attended tonight. I think everyone enjoyed it, and it was an excellent program. See y'all later. See y'all next week. Bye, Brad.
Thanks, Sean. Hooroo.